Like when we were at HubSpot, we were both individual contributors. Like since then, we've both gone through quite a lot of transitions at multiple companies, and you've built multiple teams now. So what have you learned about building effective teams?
Yeah. So I can speak specifically to this stage because I think most of my experience is centered in that kind of stage we talked about earlier of early phase startups. I think there's a few things that I think are really required for success. The first one is an innate curiosity. Like it's if you're in a world where you're building and iterating by definition, people who have an innate sense of curiosity who are going to ask like 10 levels down worth of questions to figure it out. And like I would say there are people who are oriented to searching for root cause. Like those people do really well because like each step will require that to get it to a place where all of a sudden you're like, yeah, we should do this as much as we possibly can. And like, I think a lot about like the life cycle of a channel or a tactic as like the first step is this even predictable? Like if we do it, can we tell you how much will happen? And then once you have predictability, then the next thing is like, can we do it again? And then if you have repeatability, then you can start to be like, okay, how do I optimize and scale? And in order to get through that life cycle, you need someone who just innately, regardless of marketing background or anything else, can seek where things fell short and why. And
how do you filter for that trait?
It's hard. One is what questions they ask me in interviews. I put a really strong bias on that. Like there are folks that you can tell in an interview that seek understanding based on what you said versus just like ask a question and they go, okay, and then move on to the next question on their list. And I feel bad because some people are just kind of nervous on their feet. So maybe we're screening people inappropriately with that sense. But that's not true. One person that did a really great job, like they didn't have good questions on their call, but then they sent an email afterwards, like having processed it.
Yeah.
And that's a good way to see like still curious, but more of a processor than a, real-time conversation person. So that's one way. Another is you can ask questions like, what have you learned recently? One from HubSpot that I always loved is, what's something that you're an expert in, or in a room of 1,000, what's something you're the best at? Because people who have a mechanism to get really good at something understand that it by nature takes failure and iteration.
I'm taking notes on those. Yeah, I think on the questions piece, I don't want to poke fun at it, but what's very cringe is when a candidate doesn't have any questions.
Oh, it's awful.
And I'm just like, none at all. Not like, not even generic, like what's the founding story or anything like that. Just say something. But I'm like, oh man, why did you even take this interview if you don't have any questions or any curiosity?
It's so bad, but that's my feeling. If I have a candidate and I ask them, do you have any questions? They say no. I think, well, that was a waste of my time. There's half an hour I won't get back. That's like my very first feeling if they say.
Yeah, I felt kind of like an asshole for feeling that way, but I was like, it's probably a good thing I have that feeling because that tells me I probably don't want to work with this person and they probably won't be a good fit for the company and what we need. All right, so innate curiosity. Go ahead.
I was going to say one thing to screen for is you'll get a sense for people who think they know exactly what they're going to do. And the interview is much more about like, I have a plan. That's your golden ticket. And then you're like, you don't know anything about us yet. So that's kind of a red flag because they're kind of showing you that they have a thing that they do no matter what. And like new information doesn't change their approach. So if there's questions you can get to screen for, if I give you more information, do you rethink what you're talking about? That's another pretty good indicator.
Oh, interesting. So how does that manifest? Like what's an actual example of how you do that?
Yeah. Like, so sometimes I'll ask folks to tell me about a campaign that they're really proud of or a tactic they're really proud of. And then I'll ask like, what did you learn and how did that change what you did next? And usually people will give you like a pretty good story if they have one. And if they don't, you might think, oh, they weren't holding the thread or paying attention.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. One of the things that I've found is ask about like maybe a campaign that they ran and then dig deeper. Like, tell me about what parts of it were like the most, tell me about a challenging part of that and how you got around it. Then it's digging into the weeds and you can actually tell who's kind of BSing like and taking credit for something they didn't actually have a big part in, which it gets really uncomfortable because I'm like, well, which direction do I take this conversation now? But yeah, digging 2 or 3 layers deeper to responses has been a key part of finding some of these traits for me, at least.
100%.
So you mentioned innate curiosity.
That's a good one.
That's something you filter for. How else do you think about building effective teams?
Yep. This one's pretty widely, I think, accepted, but people who are comfortable being generalists tends to do well at startups because they can kind of float and they're comfortable with, I would say, shifting responsibilities. And, a month in a startup feels like a quarter in other places. And that usually just means that the nature of your work might change a lot as you start to build those things. So people who are just excited to just try new things in general, and like, let's say repetition might not be the most exciting thing for them, and they'd rather have the opportunity to try a lot of things and maybe have already done that successfully. They do well. And if that generalist also is an expert at something important, then they do very well. So if there's someone who can say like, hey, firmly, I am world-class at this, and I also like to try my hand on a lot of things with like well-rounded skill sets, that's who you want to stack your team on in a startup, because it gives you both bedrock to build programs with adaptability if the business requires it.
That's personally interesting for me. And I'm curious if this resonates with you. I've always been a generalist. Like I have some specialty skills, but mostly I'm a generalist. And I used to feel kind of crappy about that because everyone was always talking about specialization until I realized, wait, generalists are needed, are totally necessary, especially like we hear it in this conversation now. Is that something you ran into personally? Because you strike me as quite a generalist as well.
Yeah, I definitely identify as one. Well, what's interesting is it depends on what level. It's hard to be a generalist entry level, which just sucks. So if you're someone who's like in an entry level job, it's likely that you need to specialize to move up the ladder. But then what's the catch-22 is deep specialists tend to struggle as they get higher than that because it requires things that they might not have seen. So like when I give career advice to people, I suggest that they kind of balance situations where they're building their skill sets versus there might be broadly applying them in ways that they haven't before, or seeing them executed in a way that's different. And I think that tends to work. Like if you kind of tend to pendulum between like companies that have excellence in this area and you're learning from people who really know how to do it, and then companies where you need to build things from scratch, because if you're learning from others, you kind of can be a sponge. And when you have to go apply it, that usually forces you to build more well-rounded skill sets around it because you don't have the infrastructure to do it for you. So like if you're wondering, early career people like who maybe identify as a generalist, I wouldn't be afraid to specialize. Just know that you can go build your own rotational program and get a few specializations, and all of a sudden you're a generalist that's really strong. So, and the other thing, this is something that Kip said a lot about at HubSpot, is like marketing really centralized to channels right now in terms of there's only so many. So that tends to engender really deep specialists being highly sought after. In a leadership standpoint, you then have the opportunity to just go find those specialists when you need it based on the rules of the game that you figured out and what bets you want to make, and partner with really world-class specialist agencies to do that in a way that you might not need to hire for. And a mentor of mine, Ben Cockrell at Mainstay, taught me one of the best ways you can decide how to build that team is you can have an agency help you evaluate what channels before you hire full time, because it's way easier to pivot. Like if you aren't sure if you can get enough out of paid to justify a full-time headcount, right? You can test that in a easier way by having agencies for some of it. And then you might realize, yeah, this actually does justify an agency and a full-time headcount or something like that. So there's ways to take medium bets on things that tap into specialists that you might not need to hire directly for.
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing coming out. I mean, we're in a recession now. I know some people wouldn't label it that or try to avoid calling it that, but what we thought as an agency was, oh crap, these companies are going to cut marketing budget and not want to work with contractors anymore. But it seems like the opposite, where they're saying, actually, we have to let go of full-time employees, but an agency or a contractor, we can just like hire and fire as needed. So we want to work with you to help build out this function to hedge our bets, essentially. And it sounds like that's what you're saying here, not just in the case of a recession, but when you're validating some channels, hire a contractor or an agency to test it out first.
Yep. I think it's important that you really believe in the agency, because you wouldn't want a ineffective agency to make you jaded on the channel. So like trust matters a lot if you're going to pursue this. And I don't think it's necessarily the play, but it's certainly a tool in the tool belt. Like there's no world where I could have hired a fleet of content experts to build organic, but you guys are doing that for us and it's been amazing. So that's a good example of like, you can access scale competency before you have it if you are working with really good agencies.